Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Welcome to this deep dive. We're going to be exploring the relationship between the executive branch and the press here in the U.S.
That's right. And we'll be focusing particularly on the dynamics we're seeing now during President Trump's second term, which started, back in January 2025.
Our goal today is really to get a handle on what's happening, understand the history behind it, look at the specific ways the White House is interacting with the media.
And maybe unpack what some of the consequences might be for, press freedom, but also for democracy itself.
Exactly. We want to lay it out clearly, hopefully without making it too overwhelming.
Sounds good.
So let's start maybe with a bit of history. There's something called the Fairness Doctrine.
Yeah.
What was that all about, and why is it relevant now?
Okay, the Fairness Doctrine. Well, it was an FCC policy, started way back in 1949, and the basic idea was pretty simple, actually.
Okay.
It said that broadcasters, because they were using public airwaves, which are, a limited resource, they had two main duties. First, they had to cover controversial issues that were important to the public. And second, when they did cover them, they had to make an effort to present contrasting viewpoints.
So it wasn't just a free-for-all on the airways.
Not at all. This came out of earlier laws, like the Radio Act of 1927 and the Communications Act of 1934. Both of those talked about broadcasters needing to serve the public interest, convenience, and necessity.
Ah, that phrase, the public interest.
Right. It implies a kind of public trust. Because the airwaves belong to everyone, those licensed to use them had this obligation to make sure the public heard different sides of important issues.
So holding a broadcast license came with strings attached, essentially.
Precisely. The scarcity of those broadcast frequencies was the key justification. The government felt it could and should impose certain obligations to ensure the public wasn't just hearing one perspective.
And this idea was actually tested in court, wasn't it? I think the Red Lion case.
Yes. Red Lion Broadcasting Country v. FCC, that was in 1969. The Supreme Court looked at the Fairness Doctrine and said, yes, it's constitutional.
And what was their reasoning?
It came back to that scarcity argument. Since there are only so many frequencies available, the court said the government can require licensees to share their frequency with others, in a sense, by presenting diverse views.
Interesting.
Justice White wrote the opinion, and he famously said, "It is the right of the viewers and listeners, not the right of the broadcasters, which is paramount."
So the public's right to be informed trumped the broadcaster's right to absolute editorial control.
Exactly. The First Amendment didn't give broadcasters total control over a frequency to the exclusion of other voices, according to the court in that case.
Okay, that makes sense for broadcasting, given the limited airwaves. But didn't the court rule differently for newspapers? I'm thinking of the Miami Herald case.
You're right, that's a really important contrast. Miami Herald Publishing Co. v. Tornillo, that was 1974.
What happened there?
Well, Florida had passed a law requiring newspapers to give political candidates they criticized a free right to reply in their pages. The Supreme Court struck that law down, unanimously, actually.
Why the difference?
The court stressed the editorial autonomy of the print press. Unlike broadcasting, they didn't see the same scarcity argument applying to newspapers. There wasn't a physical limit like the broadcast spectrum.
So forcing a newspaper to print something it didn't want to print was seen as a violation of its editorial freedom.
Correct. The court really emphasized that the government couldn't compel newspapers to publish specific content. It highlights a fundamental difference in how the law treated broadcast versus print media, all stemming from that initial scarcity idea.
Got it. So we had this Fairness Doctrine for broadcasters for several decades. What eventually happened to it? It's gone now, right?
It is gone, yes. The FCC itself repealed it in 1987. This was during the Reagan administration, and the FCC chairman at the time was Mark Fowler.
And what was their justification for getting rid of it?
They gave a couple of main reasons. First, they argued that the media landscape had changed dramatically. With the rise of cable TV and just generally more media outlets, they said the original scarcity argument didn't really hold water anymore.
More channels meant more viewpoints available, theoretically.
That was the argument. And second, they claimed the doctrine actually had a chilling effect on speech.
How so?
They suggested that broadcasters might just avoid covering controversial topics altogether, simply because they didn't want the hassle of having to find and present opposing viewpoints that met the doctrine's requirements.
So it might actually reduce coverage of important issues.
That was the FCC's position under Chairman Fowler.
Was the repeal controversial? I imagine not everyone agreed.
Oh, absolutely. There was significant pushback, especially from Congress. In fact, Congress actually passed a bill to write the Fairness Doctrine into law to make it permanent.
But it didn't become law.
No, President Reagan vetoed it. He argued it went against the First Amendment's guarantee of free expression, and Congress couldn't muster the votes to override his veto.
What about the courts? Did they weigh in on the repeal itself?
Yes, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals looked at it in a case called Syracuse Peace Council v. FCC, also in 1987. The court upheld the FCC's decision to repeal the doctrine.
On what grounds?
They basically accepted the FCC's reasoning that the doctrine wasn't serving the public interest anymore because of the supposed chilling effect and the growth in media diversity.
Could the court say the doctrine was unconstitutional?
Interestingly, no. The FCC itself had argued that the doctrine violated the First Amendment, but the court didn't actually rule on that specific point. It just agreed with the FCC's policy reasons for the repeal.
It feels like there was more to the repeal than just technology and legal arguments. Politics must have played a role.
Unquestionably. The Reagan administration was very focused on deregulation across the board. Repealing the Fairness Doctrine fit neatly into that broader agenda.
Less government intervention in the media.
Exactly. And beyond the principle of deregulation, there were likely strategic political considerations, too. Some probably felt the doctrine hindered the spread of conservative viewpoints or unfairly burdened broadcasters perceived as friendly to the administration.
So getting rid of it could be seen as helping create a more favorable media environment for their side.
That was certainly a perspective held by some proponents of the repeal. President Reagan's personal decision to veto the congressional bill really underscores how politically significant this issue was at the time.
Okay, let's fast forward. How does the disappearance of the Fairness Doctrine connect to the media world we live in today, especially the rise of, well, very partisan media?
It's widely seen as a major factor, maybe even a catalyst. When you remove the requirement for broadcasters to present contrasting viewpoints on controversial issues,
You open the door for outlets to just focus on one side.
precisely. It created an environment where it was commercially and politically viable to launch media outlets aimed squarely at a specific ideological audience without that regulatory obligation to provide balance.
Can you give some examples of how things changed after '87?
Sure, think about conservative talk radio. It really exploded in the late 80s and early 90s, right after the repeal. Figures like Rush Limbaugh became huge national phenomena.
And stations didn't have to worry about giving equal time to opposing views.
Exactly, that pressure was gone. And then you see the rise of 24-hour cable news networks. Fox News launched in 1996, explicitly positioning itself as a conservative voice. Later, MSNBC shifted to appeal more to a progressive audience.
So outlets could carve out niches based on ideology.
Yes. And while technology, like the expansion of cable, obviously played a huge role by creating more channel capacity.
The repeal of the Fairness Doctrine removed a key regulatory barrier that had discouraged that kind of explicitly partisan programming before.
That's a good way to put it. Fox News, for example, really tapped into that post-Fairness Doctrine landscape. It saw an opening and built a successful model around it.
What's been the effect on the audience, on us as news consumers?
Well, one major consequence has been the fragmentation of the audience. People increasingly get their news from sources that align with their existing political views.
Leading to these echo chambers or filter bubbles we hear about.
Exactly. When you're mostly hearing information that confirms what you already believe, and you're not regularly exposed to differing perspectives, it can reinforce your views and make you less willing or able to engage with people who see things differently.
Which likely contributes to the political polarization we see today.
It's certainly considered a significant contributing factor to that polarization, and arguably makes finding common ground or having a shared public conversation more difficult.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the legal framework surrounding the executive branch and the press today. What are the basic rules of the road?
Well, the absolute foundation is the First Amendment to the Constitution.
Freedom of speech and the press.
Right. And critically, that includes freedom from prior restraint, meaning the government generally can't stop something from being published before it comes out. There are very, very narrow exceptions, but the bar is extremely high.
So that's a major protection for the press.
It's fundamental. It really shapes the whole relationship. The government can't easily censor the news.
What about regulatory agencies? Does the FCC still play a role, even without the Fairness Doctrine?
Oh, definitely. The FCC still regulates broadcasting, radio, and TV. Its main lever of power over the press is its authority over broadcast licenses.
Granting them, renewing them.
denying them, or even revoking them. And the standard the FCC is supposed to use is that broad public interest, convenience, and necessity standard we mentioned earlier.
Which sounds like it could be open to interpretation.
It is, and because the president appoints the FCC commissioners, there's always the potential for political influence on how that standard is interpreted and applied.
And we're seeing moves now, under President Trump, to assert more control over agencies like the FCC.
Yes, there have been executive orders aiming for greater presidential supervision over independent agencies. The idea is to challenge their traditional autonomy and potentially bring their regulatory actions more in line with the White House's agenda. This definitely includes the FCC.
What about other parts of the executive branch? Does the Department of Justice get involved?
Yes. The DOJ has a couple of key roles. First, its antitrust division reviews media mergers. They can block deals if they think they'll harm competition or lead to too much media concentration.
So they can influence the structure of the media industry.
Potentially, yes. Second, the DOJ investigates leaks of classified information. Unauthorized disclosures.
Which can put pressure on journalists and their sources.
Absolutely. The threat of investigation or prosecution for leaks can have a significant chilling effect on government insiders who might want to talk to the press and on journalists trying to report on sensitive national security or government matters.
This tension between presidents and the press, it's not exactly new, is it? Are there historical parallels we should keep in mind?
Definitely not new. You can go back through much of American history and find friction. But the Nixon administration is often cited as a particularly relevant example.
What did Nixon do?
Well, President Nixon was famously hostile towards the press, privately calling them the enemy. His administration actively tried to use the FCC's license renewal process to pressure TV stations owned by networks he disliked, like the Washington Post.
Using regulatory power for political ends.
That was the allegation. They also launched antitrust investigations, used illegal wiretaps on journalists, and even compiled an enemies list that suggested using the IRS to target political opponents, including some in the media.
That sounds pretty intense.
It was. And even before Nixon, there are reports that the Kennedy and Johnson administrations used the Fairness Doctrine itself, strategically lodging complaints or encouraging others to lodge complaints against right-wing radio broadcasters they saw as political opponents.
So using the rules, even ones designed for fairness, as a political tool.
It illustrates that presidents have long sought ways to influence media coverage, using whatever levers of power they felt were available.
Okay, let's bring it to President Trump's first term. How did his approach during those years set the scene for what we're seeing now in his second term?
I think the defining characteristic of his first term was the sheer level of public, often aggressive rhetoric against the press.
The whole fake news narrative.
Exactly. He used that term constantly to dismiss reporting he didn't like. And he went further, frequently calling major news outlets the enemy of the American people.
That phrase has a pretty dark history.
It does. It's been used by authoritarian regimes to delegitimize dissent. One study found over 11% of his tweets in his first 2 years were critical of journalists or the media. The goal seemed to be to systematically undermine the press's credibility with the public.
So if the public doesn't trust a messenger, they won't trust the message, especially if it's critical of him.
That seems to have been the strategy. Normalize hostility towards journalists and make it easier for his supporters to dismiss unfavorable coverage.
Did the administration take concrete actions against the press during that first term, beyond the rhetoric?
Yes, definitely. There were several high-profile clashes over press access. For instance, the White House revoked the press credentials of CNN's Jim Acosta and another reporter, Brian Tarim.
Which led to lawsuits, right?
It did. And the courts generally sided with the journalists, emphasizing that there needs to be due process before credentials can be pulled. You can't just revoke access arbitrarily.
What else?
In 2020, the Associated Press had its access restricted for certain White House events. A court later found that was viewpoint discrimination, basically, punishing them for their coverage and ruled against the White House.
So direct attempts to control who gets access based on coverage.
It appeared that way. There was also that controversy in 2020 around the U.S. Postal Service and operational changes under Postmaster General Louis DeJoy, which raised concerns about potential political motives related to mail-in voting, though DeJoy denied that.
And how did Trump interact with different media outlets? It wasn't all hostility, was it?
No, it was a very distinct pattern. He clearly favored outlets that gave him positive coverage, most notably Fox News, which often amplified his messages.
But he even turned on Fox sometimes, didn't he?
He did. If their coverage wasn't sufficiently loyal or positive in his view, he wouldn't hesitate to criticize them publicly. And he actively promoted alternative, even more reliably pro-Trump outlets like OANN and Newsmax.
Suggesting he expected loyalty, not just favorable coverage.
It showed a clear expectation of loyalty and a willingness to use his platform to steer his supporters towards media that consistently reflected his narrative.
So that combination, the harsh rhetoric, the access battles, cultivating friendly media that really laid the groundwork for the second term.
I think it did. It established a pattern of confrontation and demonstrated a willingness to challenge established norms in the relationship between the White House and the press corps.
Which brings us to now President Trump's second term, starting January 2025. It seems like there's been a shift maybe towards using the levers of government power more directly against the media.
That's a key observation, yes. The approach seems to have evolved towards a more direct application of executive and regulatory authority.
Can you give an example?
A really significant move was Executive Order 142-5. It came out in February 2025, titled Ensuring Accountability for All Agencies.
What does it do?
Its stated goal is to bring independent agencies, and this explicitly includes the FCC, under much closer presidential supervision.
How?
By requiring them to submit their significant regulatory actions to the White House's Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA, and the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, for review before they can be finalized.
So the White House gets a direct say in what the FCC does.
That's the effect. It's based on something called the unitary executive theory, which argues for very strong presidential control over the entire executive branch. It fundamentally challenges the traditional independence these agencies have had.
And what does that mean for the media?
It creates a clear pathway for the White House to potentially influence FCC decisions on things like media ownership rules, license renewals, or investigations into broadcasters based on political considerations rather than just the agency's independent judgment.
And are we actually seeing the FCC, under its current leadership, taking actions that seem aligned with this?
We are seeing a number of actions under FCC Chairman Brendan Carr that critics are pointing to as evidence of this shift.
Such as?
Well, the FCC reopened an old complaint against CBS News concerning a 60 Minutes interview with Kamala Harris. This happened after President Trump publicly attacked the interview and even filed his own lawsuit against CBS.
The timing seems convenient.
Critics certainly highlighted that. The FCC also reinstated some complaints against ABC and NBC stations that had previously been dismissed.
What else?
Following President Trump's calls to defund NPR and PBS, the FCC launched investigations into their compliance with rules about underwriting, basically, how they handle sponsorships and advertising.
Targeting public media specifically.
It appears that way. And perhaps most controversially, the FCC started looking into the diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI policies at major media companies like Disney and Comcast.
How is that an FCC matter?
The suggestion seems to be that these DEI policies could somehow be relevant to whether a company is qualified to hold broadcast licenses. It's a novel interpretation, and critics see it as a way to pressure companies over broader cultural or political issues.
So the overall picture is one of the FCC launching investigations into news organizations and practices that have drawn the president's ire.
That's how many observers are interpreting it. They use terms like weaponization of the FCC, using its regulatory power to intimidate or punish media outlets perceived as critical of the administration.
Has there been any pushback against this?
Yes, some Democratic lawmakers introduced a bill called the Broadcast Freedom and Independence Act of 2025. The stated goal is to protect broadcasters from FCC actions that are based on the viewpoint of their coverage.
It's not just the FCC, though. You mentioned actions against government-funded media, too.
That's right. There's been a significant focus on the U.S. Agency for Global Media, or USAGM. That's the agency overseeing entities like Voice of America, VOA.
What happened there?
In March 2025, President Trump signed another executive order, 14238. It directed the elimination of what it called non-statutory components and functions at USAGM. The White House also put out a statement criticizing VOA.
And the practical effect.
Under a newly appointed special advisor, Kari Lake, USAGM essentially shut down VOA operations. Many employees were put on leave or had their contracts and grants terminated.
That sounds drastic. Has it been challenged?
Yes. Multiple lawsuits were filed. They allege various violations: First Amendment rights, separation of powers, the Administrative Procedure Act.
Any rulings yet?
A federal court did issue a temporary restraining order in one case, the Widakuswara v. Lake case. The judge cited likely violations of the Administrative Procedure Act and separation of powers principles as the basis for the order.
What about domestic public media, NPR and PBS?
Well, beyond the FCC investigations into their underwriting, the administration announced in April 2025 that it plans to ask Congress to rescind $1.1 billion in funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, CPB.
CPB is the entity that funnels federal money to NPR and PBS stations, right?
Correct. The administration cited alleged bias and waste as reasons. This came after President Trump had publicly called on social media to defund and totally disassociate from NPR and PBS.
So a direct attempt to cut off their federal funding stream.
That's the stated plan.
We also talked about President Trump's history of using rhetoric. Has he continued to, say, encourage boycotts or other forms of economic pressure in his second term?
The materials we're looking at for 2025 don't explicitly mention him calling for advertiser boycotts against specific news outlets right now. However, his past actions are relevant.
Like supporting boycotts of other companies?
Yes. He publicly backed Elon Musk and Tesla when they faced consumer boycotts, calling those boycotts illegal attacks. Given that history and his ongoing criticism of certain media, the potential for him to encourage economic pressure, maybe indirectly, is certainly there. It fits his pattern.
Okay, so if we try to categorize all these different actions we've discussed, from the FCC probes to the executive orders to the rhetoric, what are the main types of mechanisms being used?
We can group them into a few main buckets. First, you have the legal and regulatory tactics.
Like the FCC investigations, the potential for DOJ antitrust action, maybe leak investigations?
Exactly. And historically, though not explicitly mentioned for 2025, things like politically motivated IRS audits have also been used, so that's always a background concern.
Okay, legal regulatory, what's next?
Second is access control. This was big in the first term with credentialing fights. Now it might be shifting towards more subtle control over who gets into briefings or events, like managing the press pool more tightly or denying access beyond the pool, as happened with the AP.
Controlling the flow of information by controlling who gets to gather it.
Right. And the third category is rhetorical and informal pressures.
So the fake news talk, calling media the enemy.
Yes, that delegitimizing rhetoric continues. But also encouraging boycotts, using strategic lawsuits like the timing of the Trump v. CBS suit alongside the FCC probe, and potentially fueling online harassment against journalists through pointed criticism.
It sounds like the toolkit has expanded or become more integrated in the second term.
I think that's fair to say. The first term saw a lot of direct confrontation and rhetoric, often met with court challenges on procedural grounds. The second term seems to involve a more systematic use of the actual levers of government executive orders, agency actions, funding threats, regulatory probes all working in concert.
A more comprehensive strategy, perhaps.
It appears more coordinated and aimed at leveraging the full power of the executive branch to shape the media environment.
Even with all this, aren't there still constitutional limits? The First Amendment, the courts? But they act as a check?
They absolutely do. The First Amendment's protections against prior restraint and viewpoint discrimination are still the bedrock. The Due Process Clause was key in those earlier credentialing cases.
And libel law.
Yes. The New York Times v. Sullivan standard makes it very hard for public officials to successfully sue the press for libel. They have to prove actual malice, which is a very high bar.
And we saw a court step in recently with the VOA case.
Right, the temporary restraining order in Widakuswara v. Lake. Although it's important to note that ruling was based on procedural grounds, the Administrative Procedure Act, and separation of powers, not directly on the First Amendment itself, at least initially.
So the checks exist. But how effective are they proving to be in this current environment? Are there limits to judicial power here?
That's the critical question. While courts have pushed back, there are reasons to wonder about the long-term effectiveness.
Like as?
Well, court rulings can be narrow or just preliminary, like a TRO, and they're subject to appeal, which takes time. Also, the administration's strategies might be designed to make judicial review difficult.
How so?
Using vague standards in FCC investigations, for example, or relying on actions by the chairman rather than full commission votes might delay or complicate court challenges.
And the political context matters too.
It does. The appointment of judges seen as sympathetic to the administration's view of executive power could have an impact over time. Plus, rhetoric questioning the legitimacy of the courts themselves could potentially erode their influence.
There's also this broader push for executive power, like in Project 2025.
Exactly. Blueprints like Project 2025 explicitly call for consolidating power in the White House and reducing the independence of agencies. The fight over FCC independence via EO 14244 and the VOA case testing presidential power over congressionally funded programs, these are central battlegrounds.
So judicial review is a safeguard, but it's being actively tested.
Yes. The administration seems to be using sophisticated methods to probe the boundaries of those constitutional and judicial constraints.
It's useful to look beyond the U.S. too. The analysis you mentioned compares these trends to what's happening globally. Is there a kind of pattern, an authoritarian playbook for dealing with the media?
There really is. Researchers and press freedom groups have identified a common set of tactics used by autocratic or illiberal leaders around the world to control information.
What's in this playbook?
Key elements usually include systematically delegitimizing independent media, using regulatory agencies to apply pressure, using economic leverage, like state advertising or influencing ownership, legal harassment of journalists and outlets, taking control of public media, and generally undermining checks and balances.
Can you give examples of where this has happened?
Hungary under Viktor Orban is often cited. There, the government used state advertising budgets to reward friendly media and starve critical outlets. They facilitated the consolidation of hundreds of media outlets under a single pro-government foundation, Kesma. They also exert tight political control over public broadcasting and the media regulator, and Orban constantly uses hostile rhetoric against independent journalists. It's a model some conservatives in the U.S. have actually expressed admiration for.
Any other examples?
Turkey, under President Erdogan, has seen a drastic crackdown. Mass arrests of journalists, closure of media outlets, using anti-terror laws against reporters, state-influenced takeovers of media groups, and again, very hostile rhetoric from the top.
And India.
Under Prime Minister Modi, there's been growing concern about pressure on journalists, the government using its large advertising budget to influence coverage, the use of sedition laws, and a general climate of intimidation that encourages self-censorship.
Okay, so how do these international examples compare to what we're seeing in the U.S. under President Trump's second term? Are there parallels?
There are some striking parallels, unfortunately. The delegitimizing rhetoric, fake news, enemy of the people is almost identical to what's heard in Hungary or Turkey. The use of regulatory pressure via the FCC investigations mirrors how regulators are used elsewhere to target critical media. The moves against USA GMVOA and the push to defund CPB parallel the takeover or weakening of public media in other countries.
Economic and legal pressure, too.
The encouragement of boycotts, the strategic lawsuits, these echo the economic and legal harassment seen abroad. And challenging the independence of the FCC resonates with the broader pattern of undermining institutional checks and balances.
So it's not just random actions, but tactics that fit a recognizable global pattern.
The convergence is hard to ignore. It suggests a shared understanding among certain leaders globally of how to manage or control the media. And it places the current U.S. situation within a very concerning international trend of democratic erosion.
What are the bottom line implications of all this for democracy and press freedom here in the United States?
Well, fundamentally, these tactics, exactly. Journalists and news organizations might shy away from difficult stories. This weakens public accountability. And the constant attacks on media credibility erode public trust, making it harder for citizens to know who or what to believe.
Which seems dangerous in an age of disinformation.
Very much so. It exacerbates the polarization we talked about, fragments public discourse, and makes it easier for misinformation and conspiracy theories to spread when trust in traditional news sources is undermined. A shared basis of fact becomes harder to find.
Given these challenges, what potential responses or solutions are being discussed? Can anything be done to push back?
People are talking about various approaches. Reviving the Fairness Doctrine sometimes comes up, but as we discussed, that faces major legal hurdles today, plus questions about whether it even fits the modern internet media landscape.
So maybe other ideas.
Yes. Things like non-governmental standards for media ethics, more investment in media literacy education so people can better evaluate sources themselves, and pushing for more transparency from social media platforms about their news algorithms.
What about strengthening legal protections?
That's a big one. Ideas include a federal shield law to protect journalists' sources, laws specifically banning viewpoint discrimination by the government against the press, and legislation to reinforce the independence of agencies like the FCC.
And antitrust.
Using antitrust laws more vigorously to promote media ownership diversity and prevent too much concentration could also help ensure a wider range of voices.
Transparency seems important too.
Definitely. Requiring more transparency about who owns media outlets and how government money is spent on advertising, things like the proposed Honest Ads Act for online political ads.
Ultimately, though, does public support matter?
It's crucial. Public understanding of why a free press is important, support for press freedom organizations, journalistic solidarity, these are all vital components of any effort to safeguard press freedom.
It really sounds like press freedom is in a challenging spot right now.
It absolutely is. It's being squeezed by political polarization, economic pressures on the industry, this assertive use of executive power we've been discussing, and the complexities of new technology. The Fairness Doctrine's repeal is a stark reminder that policy choices have long-term consequences for the media environment.
So protecting it requires ongoing effort on many fronts.
It really does. It needs a sustained, multifaceted approach: legal, political, educational, and civic.
Okay, let's try to summarize the key points from our conversation today.
Sure. We saw how the end of the Fairness Doctrine helps pave the way for today's more partisan media landscape. And now, in President Trump's second term, we're seeing what looks like a significant escalation in using executive power, regulatory, legal, rhetorical, to influence and control information flow.
With tactics that echo what we see in countries where press freedom is declining.
Right. There are concerning parallels to global authoritarian trends in media control.
And the stakes for American democracy seem incredibly high.
They are. These trends risk undermining investigative journalism, weakening government accountability, and making it harder for citizens to stay informed, which is essential for democracy to function.
That certainly gives us a lot to think about. Thank you for walking us through all of this today.
My pleasure.
And for everyone listening, we'll leave you with this thought to ponder. What are the long-term consequences if these trends continue? For the balance of power in our government and for the future of informed public debate in America? And maybe consider, what role can each of us play as citizens in helping to safeguard a free and independent press?
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.